The courtroom was a blend of harsh fluorescent lights, the soft rustle of papers, and the murmurs of a few remaining cases. Naomi Winters stood quietly at the front, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. She was dressed in a simple yet professional dark jacket, a quiet elegance emanating from her every movement. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance, nothing that would catch the eye, except for her calmness in a room full of anxiety. Judge Thomas Graham sat at the bench, his demeanor stern as he scanned through the file in front of him. His brow furrowed as he read over Naomi's name. The charge listed against her, an infraction most people would have brushed off. He had seen cases like this before. Small fines, quick decisions. He had never been one to hesitate in doling out what he considered justice. Naomi had been pulled over late last night for a minor traffic infraction, driving without her headlights on in a low-visibility area. It wasn't the kind of thing that would normally land someone in front of a judge. But here she was. And as Judge Graham looked over her file, his eyes lingered on the address listed. Nothing particularly unusual there, but the assumption began to form in his mind that Naomi was just another case to deal with. "Ms. Winters," the judge began, his voice cold and clipped, "it seems you failed to turn your headlights on while driving last night. Is that correct?" Naomi nodded, her eyes unwavering, her face a mask of calm. "Yes, Your Honor, it was a mistake." The judge didn't miss the slight hesitation in her voice, but he quickly dismissed it. She was just another person who had let a small thing slip. He was used to seeing people shrug off the consequences of their actions. It was a common theme for those who appeared before him. He adjusted his glasses and set the file aside before him. "This is a serious matter," he continued, looking down at the papers again. "Driving without your headlights can cause accidents. It's careless." He glanced at her briefly. "I'm going to impose a fine of $250. Naomi didn't flinch. There was no sign of distress or frustration on her face, even as she processed the amount, which was a large sum for someone of her standing, especially considering the nature of the infraction. She simply nodded, accepting her fate without protest. She wasn't one to argue over petty issues like this, but her lack of reaction seemed to irritate the judge even more, feeding his assumption that she was indifferent and perhaps even unaware of how the law operated. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Ms. Winters?" Judge Graham asked, leaning forward slightly, his voice tinged with an unspoken expectation that she would beg for leniency. Naomi's eyes met his, and for the first time, a hint of something like steel flickered behind them. "No, Your Honor. I'm just here to take responsibility," she said quietly. Her words hung in the air, but the judge didn't think much of them. To him, she was simply another defendant who had broken the rules, someone who would leave, pay the fine, and fade from his memory. What he didn't know was that Naomi Winters had far more at stake than the judge could possibly understand. Judge Graham leaned back in his chair, eyeing Naomi with a kind of detached impatience. The case was straightforward, or so he thought, and the sooner he could wrap it up, the better. After all, there were more cases to attend to, more fines to impose, more routine judgments to make. He didn't often think twice about the people who stood before him. Most of them were ordinary citizens, living ordinary lives, caught in the web of rules that made up the fabric of society. It was his job to enforce those rules without question or compromise. "Ms. Winters," he said again, looking down at her file with a calculated air of finality, $250 should be more than enough to remind you of the importance of following basic traffic laws. It's not an insignificant amount, but I'm sure you can manage." Naomi nodded again, her face still betraying little emotion. She was no stranger to courtrooms, though not as a defendant. She had spent countless hours in legal discussions across the world, involved in high-level conversations about military law, human rights, and justice reform. But that wasn't something Judge Graham could have known from a simple glance at her. To him, Naomi was just another person to judge, and his perception of her was shaped by his narrow experience of the world. His gaze lingered for a moment, briefly flicking over her attire. The dark jacket, neat and professional, maybe a little too well put together for someone who had no legal standing. He couldn't help but wonder if she'd just thrown on whatever she had lying around. After all, that was what many of the people who appeared before him did. A lot of them were in a hurry, caught up in the daily grind, trying to get by. She wasn't asking for mercy, which in his mind meant she was probably used to the consequences of her actions. Maybe she had money to burn and wouldn't even notice the fine. Maybe this was just another speed bump on her path to wherever she was headed. It was easy to assume things when you had been in the system, as long as Judge Graham had. It was efficient, even. Naomi's composed silence continued to eat at him. Most people, especially those facing fines, either protested or showed some sort of emotional response. But Naomi was different. She wasn't trembling in fear, pleading for sympathy, or acting angry. She just accepted the fine and looked calm. Too calm, he thought. As though this was beneath her. It made him feel irritated, as though her poise somehow undermined the authority he had spent his entire career building. He cleared his throat, tapping his fingers on the bench as he met her eyes. "I trust you won't be back in my courtroom for something like this again," he said, his tone almost scolding. Naomi met his gaze unwaveringly, her expression as still as ever. "I won't, Your Honor," she said quietly, and then, almost as an afterthought, added, "Thank you for your time." The words hung in the air, but Judge Graham was already moving on. He barely registered the weight of her statement, or the faint sense that there was something more to this woman than he had initially thought. As Naomi walked out of the courtroom with the same serene composure, Judge Graham felt a faint sense of satisfaction in closing the case. He turned his attention to the next one, unaware of the extraordinary life that had just crossed his path. What he didn't know yet was that his assumption would come back to haunt him. And in ways he couldn't yet imagine, Naomi Winters was not just any defendant. As Naomi stepped out of the courtroom and into the busy hallway, the weight of the judgment settled into her thoughts. It was just another day, another minor inconvenience in a life that was rarely uncomplicated. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter with Judge Graham had been far more trivial than he realized. To him, it was nothing more than a routine case. To her, it was yet another reminder of the assumptions people made based on appearances alone. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Graham had already dismissed her case from his mind. He stood, stretched his legs, and moved on to the next case on his docket. But as he began to call the next defendant's name, his court clerk, a young woman named Sarah, approached with an odd, official-looking file in her hand. "Your Honor," Sarah said, hesitating slightly, "there's something strange about this file. I think you should see it." Judge Graham, somewhat irritated, motioned for her to hand it over. "What is it, Sarah?" Another delay. The clerk placed the file on his desk, and the judge flipped it open absent-mindedly, expecting it to be more of the same, an insignificant report on a minor infraction, perhaps some background on the defendant. But as he scanned the first few pages, his brow furrowed. The woman he had just sentenced, Naomi Winters, wasn't just another name on a list of traffic violations. The file detailed an extraordinary career, a career that stretched across continents and into the most prestigious corners of military law. He read that Naomi Winters held the rank of colonel in the military, a respected officer who had served in multiple peacekeeping missions across the globe. She had been deeply involved in shaping policies on human rights within the military, advising international bodies like the United Nations and the International Criminal Court. In short, Naomi Winters was a key figure in global military justice. The more Judge Graham read, the more his disbelief grew. How had he not known? How had he missed the weight of her position? This was no ordinary woman, no simple defendant. Naomi Winters was a leader in military justice reform, a force advocating for fairness in conflict zones where the law often bent under the pressure of power. His heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. He had just found a woman who, on a global scale, had the kind of influence most people could only dream of. a woman whose work was literally reshaping the way military forces around the world handled justice and human rights. The judge set the file down, rubbing his eyes as if he were seeing things wrong. He reread a portion of the file that outlined her efforts in setting up military tribunals in war-torn countries, ensuring that accused soldiers received fair trials, regardless of rank or background. She was instrumental in the creation of several international agreements aimed at preventing the abuse of power in armed conflicts. Naomi Winters wasn't just any military officer. She was a trailblazer. Judge Graham sat back in his chair, stunned, a mix of guilt and embarrassment flooding through him. He had seen her as just another person in front of him, caught in the web of a minor violation. But now he understood he had misjudged her entirely. The woman he had just found had spent her career ensuring that justice, real justice, was served on a global scale, and he had treated her as though she were insignificant. He glanced at the clock, a sense of urgency creeping in. Naomi had already left. Could he undo the damage he had caused? Would she even want to hear his apology? The questions hung in his mind, unanswered, as he realized that the consequences of his hasty judgment were just beginning to unfold. Judge Graham sat motionless in his chair for several minutes, the file on Naomi Winters still open in front of him. His fingers rested lightly on the pages as his mind raced to process the information he had just uncovered. He had seen the names of high-ranking officials before, military leaders and diplomats who had crossed his courtroom. But this was something different. Naomi Winters wasn't just a military officer. She was a powerful force in international law, a name respected by some of the most influential people in global justice. He replayed their interaction in his mind. Naomi had come in like any other defendant, looking just as ordinary as anyone else who had stood before him. And yet, he had missed it. His assumptions had led him to underestimate her, dismiss her as someone unimportant. A mistake that now felt like a crushing blow to his professional pride. How could I have been so blind? He muttered to himself, feeling the sting of regret intensify. He had imposed a fine without ever bothering to ask the right questions or even look beyond the surface. Naomi's composed silence, which he had interpreted as indifference, now felt like an unspoken challenge. She had known all along who she was, something he had failed to see. But there was more. Naomi's work wasn't just about abstract laws or theoretical debates. She had been instrumental in bringing justice to places where the law had been warped or ignored. The reports in her file mentioned her role in organizing military tribunals in conflict zones, making sure that soldiers and civilians alike received fair trials. She had worked tirelessly to ensure that no one, regardless of rank or position, was above the law. Naomi Winters had spent her life working on the front lines of human rights, often at great personal risk. The realization hit him hard. He had just found a woman who was literally changing the world. She was part of a network of global leaders working to ensure that fairness and justice were not just ideals, but realities in places that had never known them. And here he was, a judge in a small-town courtroom, treating her as if she were a petty offender. A wave of guilt swept over him, and he quickly stood up from his desk. His mind was spinning. Could he undo the damage? Could he fix the mistake he had made, or was it already too late? He needed to speak to her, to make things right. But how? She had left the courtroom without a word of protest, a quiet dignity that had left him with no opportunity to change his course. He paced around the room, trying to think of the right words to say. How could he apologize for something as significant as this? How could he explain to her that his judgment had been clouded by assumptions, by a lifetime of ingrained biases? Naomi Winters didn't belong in a courtroom like this, and yet she had entered one, and he had failed her. As the weight of the realization settled in, Judge Graham knew there was no simple fix. He could write a letter, perhaps, but deep down, he understood that a letter would never be enough. He needed to see her face to face. He glanced at the clock again. It was getting late. Naomi was already gone, but he had no intention of letting this mistake slip through the cracks. Not this time. As Judge Graham paced in his office, his thoughts turned to Naomi's journey, imagining the path she had taken to get to where she was now. The more he thought about her, the more he realized how little he knew of the woman he had so quickly dismissed. Her file had briefly outlined her career, but it had done little justice to the incredible story behind it. Naomi Winters didn't come from a family of privilege or powerful connections. She had grown up in a small, tightly knit neighborhood, one where opportunities were scarce and expectations often felt limiting. Raised by a single mother who worked long hours to support her family, Naomi knew early on that nothing would be handed to her. She had to fight for everything: her education, her place in the world, and eventually the opportunity to serve her country. Her mother, a determined and loving woman, had instilled in Naomi a sense of responsibility that she would carry with her throughout her life. If you want to make the world a better place, her mother would often say, you have to be willing to stand up when everyone else stays seated. It was this philosophy that had guided Naomi's every step. After high school, Naomi joined the military. She was driven by a desire to serve something greater than herself, and while the decision was unconventional for a young woman from her background, it felt like the right choice. At first, it wasn't easy. She faced challenges not only because of her race and gender, but also because of her unrelenting ambition. The military wasn't always a welcoming space for someone like Naomi, but she never let that stop her. Naomi excelled quickly, rising through the ranks with a sharp mind and a natural leadership ability. She didn't just follow orders, she asked questions, sought to understand, and made her mark by challenging outdated practices that she felt undermined fairness and justice. Her reputation began to grow, and so did the trust others placed in her. She was sent on high-stakes missions, negotiating peace agreements, and working in conflict zones to establish accountability within military operations. She was instrumental in reforming trial processes for military personnel, ensuring that those accused of war crimes were treated fairly, regardless of rank. But it was Naomi's work with international organizations that truly cemented her legacy. She became a voice at the United Nations, advocating for human rights in the most volatile regions of the world. As an expert in military justice, she helped design and implement frameworks that would ensure accused individuals had access to fair trials and legal representation. Her impact was felt in places like Syria, Afghanistan, and the Central African Republic, where power imbalances often led to injustices that went unchecked. As Naomi's career flourished, she never forgot the lessons from her childhood. Despite her success, she remained humble, never seeking the spotlight or accolades. Her work spoke for itself. She chose the path of service, never allowing herself to be defined by anyone's assumptions or biases, certainly not Judge Graham's. And now, sitting in his office, Judge Graham could see it all with new clarity. He had just found a woman whose life had been dedicated to building fairness in places where fairness didn't exist. The realization stung even more now. He wasn't just facing the consequences of a judgment call. He was grappling with the deeper truth of how easy it was for someone to overlook someone else's worth. How quickly a person could be judged by appearance, not by their actions. Naomi Winters wasn't just a defendant. She was a global leader, and he had treated her like a nobody. He was determined to fix that. The next morning, Judge Graham arrived at the courthouse with a single thought on his mind. He had to make things right. The decision to approach Naomi Winters wasn't one he took lightly. He had spent the entire night replaying their interaction, the assumptions he'd made, the error he'd committed, and the profound impact that mistake could have on her. He was no stranger to public scrutiny. After all, his position had been built on making decisions that affected people's lives. But this was different. This wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about publicly acknowledging the biases he had allowed to cloud his judgment. It wasn't enough to apologize privately. Naomi deserved better. She deserved to be treated with the respect she had earned, not just as a military officer, but as a human being who had dedicated her life to justice. As he walked into his chambers, Judge Graham's mind raced. He needed to find a way to contact Naomi, to get her attention without further alienating her. It was a fine line to walk. He couldn't simply call her out of the blue and expect her to accept his apology. No, this would require careful thought, an acknowledgement not only of the mistake he had made, but also of her extraordinary contributions. Later that afternoon, Judge Graham stood in front of the courthouse podium, a small gathering of reporters waiting for him to speak. Word had gotten out that he was making an announcement, though no one, including the press, knew exactly what it would be. His hands were slightly clammy, but he forced himself to stand tall as the room fell into a quiet hush. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, but not without the weight of the moment. "I stand before you today to publicly acknowledge a grave mistake I made during a recent court session." He paused for a moment, taking a breath before continuing. His mind briefly flashed to Naomi, how she had stood before him without fanfare or expectation, unyielding in her quiet dignity. He swallowed hard. On the surface, it appeared that the defendant, Ms. Naomi Winters, was simply here to answer for a minor traffic violation. But I failed to do something critical that I should have. I failed to recognize the magnitude of her service, her dedication to justice, and the influence she wields in the realm of international law. I made assumptions based solely on her appearance and dismissed her as just another individual caught up in a routine legal process. And for that, I am deeply sorry. The words came more easily now, though they still felt weighty. He could sense the room's attention. Everyone was listening, and some were no doubt surprised. It wasn't often that a judge took such an unusual step, admitting fault in front of a crowd. But this was different. Naomi Winters was different. "I've learned a very important lesson," Judge Graham continued. "It's easy to fall into the trap of assumptions, especially when we're dealing with people who appear to be outside of our familiar frame of reference. But no one should be reduced to a stereotype, not even in the smallest interactions. I failed to recognize the extraordinary work Ms. Winters has done in advocating for human rights and fairness in military justice around the world, and that is a mistake I regret deeply." He took a step back, looking down at the notes in his hand. Ms. Winters is not just a person to be judged in a courtroom. She is someone who has changed the world for the better, someone whose career has had a far-reaching impact, and someone who deserves respect and acknowledgement. I owe her that, and I owe it to all of you, the people who look to this courtroom for fairness, to ensure I never make this mistake again. As the room absorbed his words, Judge Graham felt a shift within himself. This apology wasn't just for Naomi. It was for himself, too. He had confronted a deeper truth about his own biases and the importance of humility in the face of justice. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He couldn't undo the past, but he could choose how he moved forward. It wasn't long before Naomi's lawyer responded to the public statement, confirming that Naomi was aware of the judge's apology. But Naomi herself, as Judge Graham would soon learn, would not be taking a private meeting or phone call. For her, words alone wouldn't suffice. Naomi had her own sense of justice, and it was far more complex than a simple apology could fix. The press conference had barely ended when Judge Graham received an email notification. It was from Naomi Winters' legal team. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it, eager yet anxious to hear her response. He had braced himself for something, anything, though he wasn't entirely sure what he expected. A cold dismissal, a polite acknowledgement, maybe even a refusal to engage, given the circumstances. What he didn't anticipate was what he found in the message. The response was short but pointed, written in Naomi's own voice. "Dear Judge Graham, thank you for your public apology. It was a necessary gesture, and I appreciate that you took the time to address your mistake. However, I would like to make it clear that while your words are noted, they do not erase the impact of your actions. Justice is not just about righting an individual wrong. It is about recognizing the broader implications of our actions. We are all accountable for how we treat others, regardless of their appearance, background, or the role they play in our society. Your apology must go beyond words. It must be reflected in how you act moving forward. I hope that in the future, you will consider the lives of those who stand before you with more thoughtfulness and respect. Justice is a process, not a decision that is made in haste, and it begins with empathy. Sincerely, Naomi Winters. Judge Graham sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Naomi's response wasn't angry, but it was firm, almost a call to action. Her words were a reminder that justice wasn't just about legal proceedings. It was about understanding, about breaking down biases, and most importantly, about true empathy for those who came before him. He couldn't help but admire her for her clarity. She was exactly as the file had described, sharp, insightful, and unyielding in her dedication to justice, no matter the form it took. Yet her message also served as a challenge. She wasn't interested in empty words. She wanted action. Naomi's career had been built on concrete changes, on improving systems that were inherently flawed, on speaking up for those whose voices were silenced. She wasn't simply asking for an apology. She was asking him to prove that he had learned something, that he understood the larger ramifications of his mistake. Judge Graham knew that he couldn't just move on from this moment. He needed to do more than acknowledge his failure in a public forum. He had to show Naomi and the world that he could change, that he could use his position of authority to do more than make quick judgments. He drafted a response to Naomi's legal team, making a promise to meet with her personally. In it, he expressed his genuine regret and offered a proposal to establish a workshop for local judges and legal practitioners, one focused on addressing unconscious biases and ensuring that fair judgments were made, regardless of a defendant's background. He outlined how he hoped to use his own experience, as painful as it was, to foster a deeper understanding of what true justice meant, not just in theory, but in practice. He hit send, and though the road ahead seemed uncertain, he felt a sense of commitment stir within him. He had made a mistake, but now he had the opportunity to learn from it, to turn this failure into something greater. What Naomi had shown him wasn't just the importance of fairness. It was the true power of accountability, and the realization that no one was ever too important to learn from their mistakes. Weeks passed since Judge Graham's public apology, and the legal community had been buzzing about his commitment to reform. His proposal to create workshops addressing unconscious bias was met with cautious optimism, but there were still skeptics. In some circles, it was seen as a necessary first step. In others, it was viewed as an attempt to repair a tarnished reputation. But in Naomi Winters' eyes, the judge's actions would ultimately speak louder than his words. Judge Graham had waited patiently for a response to his email. He understood Naomi's position. Her message had made it clear that she wasn't interested in lip service. She was about action, not apology. And while he was ready to make changes in his professional life, he knew he had to prove himself to her and to the community, both personally and professionally. What he hadn't expected, however, was the phone call he received one rainy afternoon. The voice on the other end was familiar, and the calm, measured tone immediately put him on edge. "Judge Graham," Naomi Winters said, her voice unwavering. "I've reviewed your proposal. While I stand by what I said, I'm willing to meet you halfway. Let's have that conversation you've asked for." Judge Graham's heart raced. He had feared that Naomi might decline his offer, that she might dismiss him completely. But now, there was a chance to show her he was serious. "Ms. Winters," he began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I can't express enough how much I appreciate this opportunity. I've learned so much already from your words, and I'm committed to doing the work. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we can move forward together." Naomi's response was direct. "It's simple," she said. "You're offering a workshop for your colleagues, but I want to ensure it's more than just a lecture. I want it to be a conversation, a partnership. We're talking about real change here, not just a one-time event. If you truly want to address bias and inequality in the legal system, we need to bring in people who've experienced it firsthand." She paused for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "I want to help you develop this workshop, Judge, but it has to be done right. We need to make sure that it's not just about theory, but about practical steps that can be taken. Steps that will make a difference in the lives of those who are most vulnerable to discrimination within the justice system. Judge Graham listened intently, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his responsibilities in a way that wasn't about enforcing the law but about living it, about understanding it from every angle. Naomi was offering him a chance to do something that could leave a lasting impact, not just in his courtroom, but throughout the entire judicial system. When the conversation ended, Judge Graham knew the real work was about to begin. He wasn't just facing a chance to redeem himself. He was facing an opportunity to collaborate with someone who had dedicated her life to fairness, to human rights, to justice. Together, they could create something powerful, something lasting. Over the next few months, they worked side by side, building a curriculum that brought together voices from all walks of life, legal professionals, activists, and individuals who had experienced the injustice firsthand. Naomi's perspective shaped every part of it. Her presence in the workshop was a reminder that real change didn't come from simply acknowledging bias, but actively working to dismantle it, brick by brick. Judge Graham knew he had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. Naomi Winters had shown him the true power of justice, not in courtrooms, but in the way people treated each other, the way systems could evolve when given the chance. In the end, their partnership wasn't just about correcting one mistake. It was about creating a future where mistakes could be acknowledged, corrected, and transformed into something better for everyone.